The 29th Path, Malkut to Netzach. Key, Kof, back of the head. Spiritual significance, Pisces, the fishes. Theory, ruler of the flux and reflux, child of the sons of the mighty. Colors, crimson, buff, flecked, silver white. Light, translucent, pinkish brown, stone. Text. The 29th path is the corporeal intelligence, so called because it forms every body, which is formed in all the worlds, and the reproduction of them. 1. As is plainly stated in the Yetziric text, this path has much to do with the physical body, the great complex of blood, flesh, bone, and sinew that the spirit uses to manifest in earth. It is the concerned with the basic instincts, particularly sex, the reproduction of further physical bodies. It is thus a path in which mind plays little part, and so may cause a certain feeling of repugnance in any who operate more or less exclusively in the sphere of the mind, or who, for reasons of what they would probably call good taste, do not care to dwell upon the facts of physical life and the chemical and biological factors of their own being in earth. 2. The mind quite often feels repelled when trying to face the fact that a large part of its functioning is conditioned by factors of brute physical existence, the driving basic instincts of sex and power as postulated by Freud and Adler, and the secretions of the ductless glands which to a large extent regulate personality. The fact of our biological physical roots is one of the things which has to be faced on the 29th path. 3. This does not mean, though, that we are entirely conditioned by them, or a mere product of them, as some advocates of Freudian and Adlerian psychology, endocrinology, behaviorism, and so on would have us believe. The spirit and individuality are, or should be, quite capable of controlling the instrument of the personality in spite of the more animal and more automatically reflex parts of man. We are rooted in instinct and in the mindless protoplasmic regions of physical existence, and necessarily so, but this does not mean that we have no responsibility for our actions. And of course our standards must always change. One does not expect the savage to have quite the fine sense of individual ethics that one should expect from the highly civilized man. 4. The trend of civilization is increasing control over instinctual man, the old Adam, but civilized man ignores the instincts at his peril. There is, of course, an ethic of the instincts shown in wild animal life and very primitive man, and this is to be expected. For the path connects with Netzach, a sephira as holy as any other, from which are projected the forces of God that we might call the laws of nature. Man, however, has other contacts with the divine, represented by the 32nd and 31st paths immediately, and indeed by all the other paths, all the other higher paths of the tree. The influences of these force him forward on the way of psychological evolution, take him from the mere blind observance of the laws of nature, of natural man, of the animals, and give him the impulse to formulate and implement the laws of civilization or humanity. In other terms, this long evolutionary pioneering journey could be called, on the physical level, the way in between, leading from the Garden of Eden, the perfect beginning, to the New Jerusalem, the perfect ending. 5. However, man never escapes from the primitive. He can control it and even transcend it, but in physical life it is always with him. The acceptance of this is perhaps the main lesson of the 29th path. It is a path of physical evolution, a going back into the primitive path of brontosauri, saber-toothed tigers, savagery, nature red in tooth and claw, concealed behind which is the traditional Isis of nature in Netzach. 6. The tarot card assigned to this path is the moon, ruler of flux and reflux, child of the sons of the mighty. This card shows a crayfish emerging from a stream or pond onto a path which leads between two towers into a wild range of hills lit by the light of the moon. On either side of the path are a dog and a wolf, and drops of blood fall from the moon. 7. This is a good composite symbol of the processes of physical evolution, the primitive amphibious forms emerging from the brackish water onto land and essaying a long journey of evolution. The towers can be said to represent the opposite poles of manifestation, and the dog and the wolf show the wild and domesticated versions of a same general species. The dog is an animal sacred to Hecate, goddess of the moon, and the primitive sexual side of the card is also apparent when one considers that to the Greeks the sound of a dog howling at the moon was the apotheosis of obscenity. The blood dripping from the moon is a reminder of the red and tooth and claw aspect of nature, and they are sometimes shown in the form of letter yods, signifying spermatozoa, the basic simplicity and root of animal life. The moon is associated with the great cyclical movements of tides on the Earth's surface and also with the growth of vegetation and with the menstrual cycle of women. This cyclic activity no doubt accounts for the title of the trump, ruler of flux and reflux. The alternative title, child of the sons of the mighty, seems to signify the primitive elemental aspects of the path, the elemental kingdoms being creations of the created. That is, creations of the sons of God, not of God, the mighty Logos itself. 8. The key to the path, the Hebrew letter Kof, bears with it the symbolism of the back of the head. This attribution is strongly suggested by the shape of the letter, which is like the hind part of the cranium with the top of the spinal column attached. The spinal cord is the center for many automatic responses and reflexes. The hind brain contains the medulla oblongata, through which pass nerve fiber tracts, uniting the spinal cord and brain. Also the cerebellum, which receives impulses from muscles, tendons, and joints via the spinal tracts and thus regulates postural activity. One of the marks of advancing stages of evolution is the change of posture from horizontal to the vertical carriage of the spine. In esoteric terminology, the medulla oblongata is often referred to as the ultima major psychic center. The intimate connection of the back of the head with the physical coordination of the body recalls the description of the path in the Yitzhak text, the corporeal intelligence. 9. The astrological attribution of the path is Pisces, the fishes. In the heavens, the two fish are spaced quite widely apart and joined by a long ribbon or string, a kind of umbilical cord perhaps. At one level of interpretation, this could be taken to be the individuality and personality linked together in the worlds of form. In early form experience, the individuality is held captive in form by the personality, but as evolution progresses, the situation is reversed so that the personality is held under the control of the individuality. This is the long-term view of the principle of flux and reflux, the ebb and flow of the direction of growth of the spirit's vehicles into and out of form. And this, of course, is a principle which applies to the highest cosmic levels as well, giving an insight to the higher significances and possibilities of these psychological paths. 10. The conventional symbol for the constellation Pisces shows two crescents facing opposite ways and connected, again an indication of the moon, and flux and reflux. There is also the more physical interpretation of the symbolism, and this is the physical sexual aspect of the path, shown by two labia parted by a shaft. These labia, the feminine sexual organs, are the gates of conception and also of birth. Ascending the path can be considered a species of psychic fecundation, therefore, and descending it a process of birth to the physical. The source of the power of fecundation and the birth is the vibrant Sephira Netzach, one of whose goddesses is Aphrodite, the awakener. The sexual aspects of this path, though, are more the physical and etheric sides of sex than the emotional polarity of it, which refers more to the 28th path from Yesod to Netzach. Aphrodite was said to have been born of the sea foam, and the sea is the most obvious physical example of the principle of flux and reflux. She was carried to land in a mussel shell, again, a link with the primitive crustacean forms of life. The use of the crustacean as an example of primitive life forms emphasizes the mechanics of building up form vehicles about the spirit, just as the shell builds about the simple living creature. 11. Response to stimuli, the awareness of and reaction to an objective world, has various grades of development. The most primitive form is the reflex action, an automatic movement of nerve cells and the associated muscles which we have already considered under the symbolism of the Hebrew letter Kof. The next stage consists of tropisms, obligatory movements of the whole animal, which becomes common to groups of animals of the same kind. Thus, the group angels of species could perhaps be assigned to the Sephira Netzach, the archetypal patterns of every bird and beast. Then comes instinctive behavior, which is seen at its most organized form in ants, wasps, and bees. The beehive is a profound esoteric symbol, traditionally brought to Earth from Venus as a pattern for early man of the goal of civilization, the cooperation of all for the common good, which is by no means incompatible with the full development of human free will. The highest form of civilization will necessarily be composed of highly evolved and spiritually directed men and women. And so the improvement of world organization lies in religion and not politics. And by organization is not meant the stereotyping of habits of small, uncreative cogs in a social machine, but willing cooperation in a corporate adventure. Many are perfect organization men and women, their lives stereotyped by habit from morning till night. But such are almost dead souls, for habit is a killer unless used creatively. That is, in order to release the mind for other activities. 12. There is, however, much of the habitual and instinctual upon this path, for it is also a segment of the etheric plane, as will be gathered by the tarot card attributions of the moon. In her novel, The Sea Priestess, Dion Fortune's hero, communing with the moon whilst convalescent, describes very well this level of existence. Now I cannot tell what I said to the moon, or what the moon said to me, but all the same, I got to know her very well. And this was the impression I got of her, that she ruled over a kingdom that was neither material nor spiritual, but a strange moon kingdom of her own. In it moved tides, ebbing, flowing, slack water, high water, never ceasing, always on the move, up and down, backwards and forwards, rising and receding, coming past on the flood, flowing back on the ebb, and these tides affected our lives. They affected birth and death and all the processes of the body. They affected the mating of animals and the growth of vegetation and the insidious workings of disease. They also affected the reaction of drugs, and there was a lore of herbs belonging to them. All these things I got by communing with the moon, and I felt certain that if I could only learn the rhythm and periodicity of her tides, I should know a very great deal. But this I did not learn, for she could only teach me abstract things, and the details I was unable to receive from her because they eluded my mind. End quote. 13. The italics are our own, and they emphasize an important point. For the things here described cannot be formulated and categorized at all readily by the mind. This is the sphere where the natural psychic and the natural healer are at home, and such are not usually intellectually minded, but work by feel and intuition. There is, unfortunately, still a large gap between the scientists and the intuitives. Often the former are all too mind-bound, and the latter all too unscientific. So we tend to get pedants and academics on the one hand, and quacks and faddists on the other. Both types superstitious and narrow-minded, each in their own fashion. Yes. 14. The natural world and its etheric counterpart, corresponding to the potencies of the 29th path, do represent a barrier and even a frightening, illogical horror to the mind. For the mind does not operate in these regions except at a primitive instinctual level. Thus, this path represents a confrontation on one level with nature, red in tooth and claw. 15. In his early novel, Watt, by Olympia Press, from Paris, Grove Press, New York, Samuel Beckett gives a horrific example of the recoil of the human mind from the natural world. Watt and his friend, alone in a strange garden in an alien universe, are in the habit of going down to the stream to look at the rats. Quote, and then we would sit down in the midst of them, Watt says, and give them to eat out of our hands of a nice fat frog or a baby thrush. Or, seizing suddenly a plump young rat resting in our bosom after its repast, we would feed it to its mother, or its father, or its brother, or its sister, or to some less fortunate relative. It was on these occasions, we agreed, after an exchange of views, that we came nearest to God.